In the summer light of Provence, a farmer stepped into a field and found the quiet broken by something impossible. A craft, a figure, and a patch of earth that seemed to remember the moment. What really landed in Valensole? Valensole sits in southeastern France, where wide farmland meets dry hills and long summer skies. In 1965, that open landscape gave one witness a clear view, and for some, a case that never quite closed. The setting matters because this was not a remote wilderness or a crowded city street. It was a working field in full daylight where distance, silence, and visibility all worked against confusion. The farmer at the center of the story was Maurice Masse, a local man known for his routine and his land. According to later reports, he was about to begin an ordinary morning task when the ordinary slipped away. He later described hearing an unfamiliar sound and seeing a low object resting in the field. Near it, he claimed, stood a small figure that seemed less like a passerby than a presence waiting to be noticed. What made the account endure was its restraint. Masse did not tell a story of spectacle and fantasy. He described a brief, startling encounter that ended as quickly as it began, leaving him shaken and alone. Soon after, investigators and journalists began asking the obvious question: what exactly had been seen, and what physical trace remained behind? In Valensole, the answer seemed to lie in the ground itself. Reports from the site described a circular depression and plants that appeared pressed or altered around the center. For believers, that pattern suggested a landing, not a passing glance or a misread shadow. That detail matters because the field was not just a stage for a sighting, it became a scene of evidence. If the witness was mistaken, the ground still had to explain why it looked disturbed in such a specific way. The story grew stronger when the description of the object was compared with other mid-century reports from France and beyond. A low, silent craft, a brief encounter, and a sudden departure fit a pattern many enthusiasts know well. Masse also described a small being with an oversized head and unusual movements, a figure that seemed more observed than imagined. That single detail has kept the case alive for decades because it is hard to file away neatly. The encounter reportedly ended with a kind of paralysis or immobilizing effect, followed by a return to normality once the craft left. Whether read literally or not, that sequence gives the account a strange internal logic. Then came the practical problem of time. If the event happened as claimed, it unfolded fast, in daylight, with no long opportunity to build a story from hearsay. That speed is part of why the case still feels sharp. Local reports and later retellings gave the sighting a public life, but the core claim stayed the same. An ordinary man, in an ordinary field, saw something extraordinary close enough to leave a mark. That is the heart of Valensole. Supporters of the case point to the witness's consistency over time and the physical disturbance at the site. To them, the combination feels less like folklore and more like a brief encounter with an intelligence outside familiar categories. They also note how the object was said to be low, quiet, and close enough to be described in detail without the language of fantasy. That kind of plain description can be more unsettling than anything dramatic. At the same time, the case has always invited careful skepticism. Memory can sharpen and distort, and a brief encounter in bright countryside can be harder to reconstruct than it first appears. Some researchers have suggested that the object may have been misperceived, that the figure may have been a person or an animal, and that the field marks could have had a more familiar origin. Those possibilities deserve room, yet none of those explanations fully settles the emotional weight of the report. Something happened to Maurice Masse that morning, and the precision of his account has kept the door open for decades. The most compelling detail may be the simplest one. The encounter did not unfold in a laboratory or a rumor chain, but in direct contact with the land. The field, the witness, and the trace all point back to one moment. That is why Valensole remains more than a local curiosity. It sits at the intersection of testimony, physical trace, and the possibility that human history still contains brief, unexplained interruptions. The case also survives because it is so specific. A summer morning, a farmer at work, a low craft, a small figure, and an aftermath that seemed to resist easy dismissal or easy proof. In that specificity lies the mystery. Broad legends can drift, but a narrow report with a named place and a clear setting keeps asking for an answer that never quite arrives. If the witness saw a machine, then the question becomes who built it and why it would appear above a French farm. If he did not, then the question becomes why the story still feels so difficult to reduce. For believers, Valensole is one of those rare cases where the ground, the timing, and the testimony seem to echo one another. For skeptics, it is a reminder that extraordinary moments can be interpreted in more than one way. What remains unresolved is not just what was seen, but what kind of event leaves a person certain enough to speak, yet leaves the world with so little to hold. That tension is what keeps the Valensole Encounter alive. The case invites a careful kind of wonder, one that does not rush to conclusions. Something may have visited that field, or something may have been misunderstood there, but the silence around the center of the story still feels charged, and perhaps that is why this French farm report endures. It does not promise certainty, it offers a moment when the familiar landscape seemed to open for a few seconds onto something else. Decades later, the field is still just a field, but the question remains suspended above it. In Valensole, did a farmer witness a machine from elsewhere, or the most puzzling mistake of his life? Either way, the encounter left behind more than a local legend. It left a clean, enduring riddle. When the land itself seems to testify, what are we meant to believe? The best accounts do not always end with answers. Sometimes they end with a place, a witness, and a sky that still looks as open as it did on that summer morning in Provence. Valensole remains one of those cases, grounded in a real location, anchored by a real testimony, and still large enough to hold both doubt and wonder at once.